Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's seminar hosted by the Bloomberg American Health Initiative. I'm Marianne Amos, Director of Communications for the initiative. Today we have the pleasure of hearing from Ayelet Hines, who will be giving a talk titled Think Like a Community Organizer. A note that this seminar is being live streamed, and those that are watching on the live stream are welcome to submit questions during the Q&A portion. So those of you on the live stream can send those questions to mamos, that's MAMOSS, at jhu.edu, or you can comment directly on our tweet about the live stream, and our Twitter handle is American Health. Ayelet has 3 decades of experience working on campaigns for public health, workers' rights, the environment, human rights, public safety, gay rights, environmental justice, animal rights, and political candidates in more than 20 states and internationally. Her career has involved organizing, strategic communications, nonviolent direct action, lobbying, training, get out the vote, fundraising, and publishing for the Environmental Defense Fund, the Sierra Club, Amnesty International, American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, the Democratic National Committee, Texas Observer, the National Democratic Institute, and more. I can't wait to hear more from you, Ayelet. This is amazing. She teaches Introduction to Campaigning and Organizing at the Bloomberg School. Ayelet is also the director of the Center on Alcohol Marketing and Youth here at the Bloomberg School. But we wanted to note that she organizes around alcohol in that capacity, but she's just as comfortable, and I think you'll hear that from her today, speaking about a wide range of topics, and she comes at this work not as an issue expert, but as an organizer, and so that is the topic of her talk today, Think Like a Community Organizer, and thank you, Ayelet. I'll pass it to you.
Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for joining me today. I'm Ayelet. It's like I yell it, you yell it, they yell it, that's how you say it. I appreciate that introduction. I do direct the Center on Alcohol Marketing and Youth in the Health, Behavior, and Society Department of the School of Public Health. And so I always like to start by getting a sense of who is in the room, just to see who has what experience with organizing. So if anyone has, let's see a show of hands for anyone who has experience working on an election campaign as a volunteer or as paid staff. What'd you do? Volunteer.
Walked in parades, rode on it, door to door. I think mostly that kind of press, walking around making people aware. It was for a county campaign.
For a county campaign? And in the back?
I'm going to run the microphone around. Sorry, we didn't catch yours, but if you want to speak, I'll come to you with the mic.
Sure. I did door-to-door campaigning on lots of campaigns. Phone banking, just about anything. I've worked on a lot of different campaigns, but it's a lot of outreach, identifying people who are likely voters and reaching out to tell them about your guy or gal.
And over there in the other corner, will you please share with us what kind of experience you have working on an electoral campaign? What did you do?
Hey, so right now I'm doing some organizing work for the Pakistani American Political Action Committee. So we're doing some advocacy work and maintaining donor relations to help support some of the local elections for next year.
Excellent. So issue campaigns. Who has worked on a campaign that was trying to solve a specific problem? Like trying to clean up a river or direct funding or, again, in the back, Molly.
So one recent campaign I worked on was the Clean Energy Jobs Act that just passed in Maryland, increasing our commitment to renewable energy to 50% by the year 2030.
And what kind of work did you do as part of that campaign?
Well, we did some organizing, did some fundraising, house parties, getting other people to do house parties, reaching out to funders, meeting with lawmakers, lining up people who could testify. I don't know, it's kind of a blurb.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, anyone else? Yeah. What did you do on an issue campaign? Yes, please.
I'm a part of a group that organized after the Women's March in Anne Arundel County. We're called WISE. So we've organized around a number of different bills in the Maryland House, and you go to the delegate breakfasts on Friday mornings, and I put together, with input from a lot of people, a legislative brochure that we say which legislation we're highlighting, and then we do a scorecard at the end of the session.
Very good. And what have you done on an issue campaign?
One issue campaign that I was part of was in California, and it was called Stop Urban Shield. And it was part of a network of public health organizers called Public Health Awakened. And we did a lot of coalition building and some direct action to successfully shut down a huge expo and training event that would help police become more militarized in their technology and their training.
Very good. Thanks for sharing. And how about any experience in the room working on a labor campaign as a shop steward working for a union? I'll never get many takers on that one. Not as many as I'd like to see. Okay, good deal. So here's what we will cover today. A little bit about who I am. I don't know why that font's so small, but what campaigning, organizing, and advocacy are for our purposes today, how to build power, and opportunities to get organizing experience. So for real, this all started for me with Kermit the Frog. So I was 13 years old, living in San Antonio, where I'm from, listening to the college radio station. And there was a public service announcement. Came on the radio, Kermit said, "Hi-ho, this is Kermit the Frog. If you love animals," which I did, "send a postcard," and this was 1986, you can do the math on that. That's what we used back then. "Send a postcard to this animal welfare organization, and you'll get an action kit in the mail." And I didn't know who the group was, I didn't know what an action kit was, but I knew that I loved animals. So I did as Kermit instructed, and I got this folder in the mail, and I became a letter writing machine. I was getting everyone I knew to send letters to members of Congress urging them to improve the lives of factory farmed animals, ban steel leg hold traps, ban canned bear hunts, things like that. So I learned at a pretty young age what was possible if people applied political pressure to policymakers to get what they wanted. What I do today is only slightly more sophisticated than that, but the fundamentals are the same. In the intervening years, I have done everything from nonviolent direct action to get out the vote and all the, like a whole range of advocacy activities on a whole bunch of issues. But it really all started when I was a kid. So I believe you're never too young to start working on these things. So what I've also learned along the way is that there are two kinds of political power, right? There's money power and there's people power. So if you're working to do something in the world other than make rich people richer, you're probably going to be outspent by your opposition. So you need to organize people better than they do so that you also can access the levers of power. Now here's my working model of change. So there's always a decision maker who can give you what you want. And that decision maker is responsive to a wide variety of influences. So part of our jobs as advocates is to make sure that our voices are heard and influential. So we work with other organizations to pressure decision makers. We engage communities. We get our voices in the media. We present our research. And there's also the pressure applied by lobbyists, whether they are your lobbyists or your opponents. And we can also become decision makers ourselves, right? So let's start with an example of organizing. Imagine for a moment that there's a convenience store near where you live and they sell candy cigarettes, which are not a thing of the past. My children bring home candy cigarettes in their Halloween trick-or-treat bags, like now. So you see these candy cigarettes, they're sitting on a shelf like 3 feet off the floor, right where little eyes can see them, and you think that they encourage young people to pick up smoking. So you go to the store manager and you tell her that you want her to stop selling candy cigarettes. So she says to you, well, some parents buy them for their children, and it's not my job to police what parents do. And you can safely interpret that to mean that the store manager does not feel threatened by losing your business. But what if there were more of you demanding change? What if you then talked to a neighbor and the two of you drafted a petition and you went door to door and you collected 200 signatures on a resolution calling for a ban on the sale of candy cigarettes in your area? And then what if you and 15 neighbors brought those signatures to a city council meeting, urging the city council to pass a resolution supporting area merchants and pulling these things off their shelves? And then you got a reporter to do a story on the outraged neighborhood that's battling the sale of candy cigarettes. And then what if after that story ran, you started an online petition? You got 800 people to sign a petition in favor of a sales ban on these products. Then the store manager will listen and act, because the manager doesn't so much care about losing just one person's business, but they do care about losing the business of a lot of people. So policymakers are motivated in the same way, right? They don't really care so much about losing one vote, but they sure do care about losing lots of votes. So you get this kind of power through organizing. If you want to see another kind of organizing in action, follow political money and influence back to its source. So it largely flows from wealthy interests who hire lobbyists who collect campaign contributions from wealthy interests who get policymakers elected, and then those policymakers do the bidding of wealthy interests. So again, if you don't have the money to access the levers of power, then you're going to have to organize enough people to do it. You're going to have to do it at the right time with the right request of the right people. So what do we mean by advocacy here? So generally speaking, advocacy means speaking up on behalf of someone else. So it could mean like a social worker speaking up for a returning vet to connect that person with all the services to which he or she is entitled, right? But for our purposes, we're going to focus on advocacy for policies that affect large numbers of people, rather than advocacy for an individual. So advocacy here is the solutions, strategies, and actions that are used to influence public and private sector decision-making at the local, state, national, or international level. So we use advocacy to create a shift in public opinion. We use it to direct money and also to change corporate behavior. So we're not just talking about public policy, we're talking about corporations. If there is one message you walk away from here with today, whoops, it's not this. It's, this, that public education is not enough. Right? It's not durable, it's not enforceable, it's difficult and expensive to reach large groups. I'm going to go back to this one though. Social justice advocacy specifically, that focuses on shifting the underlying power relationships. That's what we're interested in doing here. And I want to tell you to beware of programs and quick fixes. So if you have a community that has serious grievances, beware of government saying, we'll give you this little program just to keep you quiet. Like, have an eye for whether or not the community is now more powerful than it was. And then quick fixes, you might know someone at the top who can just give you the thing you want, but then you forego building political power, because we go back to policymakers with harder and harder requests, and we need to build influence over time. So just beware of getting something done too quickly. So if you want to make an organizer cry, spend a bunch of time and money on things that don't shift power and don't make any difference, like handing out junk at health fairs. Now on to my favorite geometric shape. This is called the Health Impact Pyramid. It was developed by Dr. Thomas Frieden, the former director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And Dr. Frieden's pyramid illustrates what I've been talking about. And it was designed to demonstrate the effectiveness of different types of public health interventions. But what it illustrates is true for so many fields, not just public health. So you see that health and education counseling are at the top of the pyramid. And under that, clinical interventions, that's ongoing care from doctors. The middle layer of the pyramid, long-lasting protective interventions, those are interventions that are like one-time or infrequent, but they have a long-lasting impact, like immunizations or smoking cessation programs, things like that. They're still delivered to one person at a time, though they might be delivered population-wide. The fourth layer of the pyramid, changing the context to make individuals' default decisions healthy, by which he means public policies like clean water and safe roads. And the bottom layer of the pyramid addresses socioeconomic factors like racism, poverty, education, homelessness. So the line on the left shows that the impact, that's the impact line, impact of public health initiatives is highest at the base of the pyramid, and their effectiveness is reduced as you go up. And the line on the right here, increasing individual effort needed, you can see that the amount of effort needed for an intervention to work goes up near the top, and you need less, the least effort at the bottom. So the bottom line here is that the greatest improvements in public health come from addressing the socioeconomic status of the poor and enacting public health policies that improve lives. Of course, interventions at all levels are important, right? If you want to provide the most sustainable and comprehensive benefits, but the most powerful effects are found at the bottom. So the focus of a lot of public health interventions is like the inverse of this. We tend to spend a lot of time and money trying to teach people how to be healthy, and if only you'd walk more, and education about drug use, when these are in fact the least effective ways to change behavior. So this isn't to say that those efforts are entirely wasted, but to be most effective, we have to move down the bottom, like towards the bottom layers of this pyramid. And that's what social justice advocacy is all about. So it does matter to every individual, right? And I like to make a difference at both ends. That's why I've been vegan for 30 years and adopted from foster care, because it matters to everyone. But like to make the biggest difference I can with my short little lifespan, I spend my working hours at the bottom two layers. So I want to give you an example from my career. So I was part of the direct action environmental movement protecting ancient forests in the Pacific Northwest many years ago. And I was working with a community that would literally put their bodies and lives on the line, right? Like blockading, logging roads, sitting in trees. You get the idea. But they do that to protect this one patch of forest, and then this other patch of forest, and then this other patch of forest, hoping that the national forest manager for each of these forests would make the right decision to protect these ancient trees. But I didn't want to have to convince each forest manager to do the right thing. I wanted the decision to have already been made for that person way upstream. So that's when I started working on federal policy. I wanted that decision to already be made. Because when you depend on an individual to make the right choice, there's an infinite number of variables, and you have to win that battle every time. It's like, I don't have to convince you to drink clean water versus contaminated water. Why? Because you turn on the tap and clean water comes out. Why? Because it's the law. Why? Because public health advocates like you built a movement to make it the law. I don't have to convince you to drive on safe roads versus unsafe roads. Why? Because you get in your car and you're driving on safe roads. That's the only thing out there. Why? Because it's the law. Why is it the law? Public health advocates built a movement to make it the law. But I don't have any strong feelings about it, obviously. Okay, so these are the elements of a campaign plan. And we'll go through each one here in a bit. You talk to different organizers. Everyone has their own secret sauce or formula, but these are generally all the elements everyone has to think through. So the first two elements are problem and issue, and this is where a lot of people get stuck. So it's tempting to set your sights on like a big depressing problem like climate change, but tackling such a huge problem is generally a recipe for defeat. Like, who do you go to? Who can solve climate change? I don't know. So you need to slice off a solvable, actionable piece of the big problem. For example, you might choose that the issue you work on is greenhouse gas emissions from the dirtiest coal-fired power plants. Now, how you talk about your issue to motivate people is called framing, and you have to learn more about that too. But you could frame this issue like this. Our children are having asthma attacks caused by pollution from the coal-fired power plant in Harper County. So we have to pass House Bill 33 this year to end the federal subsidies that keep the plant going, even when green energy is really cheaper and healthier. So now you've cut an achievable solution, shuttering the dirtiest coal-fired power plant, out of a big problem, climate change, in such a way that is motivating to supporters and potential supporters. So a couple problems that I work on today are racism and violence. This is one way it manifests itself in Baltimore City, is alcohol-driven violence. One of the issues that I work on, so here's an example of an issue cut from that big problem. So by 2022, the Baltimore Liquor Licensing Commission denies license renewal for problem liquor stores and sham taverns in the Coldstream, Homestead, Montebello neighborhoods. That's actionable, specific. Like, we know who can give that to us. It's not just the big depressing problem and you don't quite know what to do with it. This is a solvable piece of that problem. But since turning a problem into an issue is where lots of people get stuck, let's go through a few more. Let's say what motivates you is obesity. So that's a problem. What could be an issue cut from that problem? pass a 10-cent sugar sweetened beverage tax through the city council by 2022. You'll notice I try to use SMART goals here, right? Specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound. Let's say what motivates you is opioids. How do you solve that problem? Well, you got to cut a smaller piece from it. An example could be by 2023, the state legislature passes a joint resolution supporting the establishment of overdose prevention sites throughout the state and commissions a task force to plan implementation. That's something you can go to a policymaker and say, make this happen. Like, you can't really go to a policymaker and say, solve the opioids problem. That's too big. But this is actionable. Homelessness is a big problem. One of many issues you could choose out of that big problem. By 2022, the governor includes in her budget request to the legislature $20 million to create a drop-in space for homeless youth to access youth-friendly, comprehensive services, including housing resources, case management, basic necessities like food, shower, laundry, and medical and mental health care. Actionable. A few more. Big problem. Transgender women of color are murdered daily. How do you solve that? One piece of that big problem that you might tackle could be you elect a district attorney in 2020 who's committed to prosecuting hate crimes against transgender people. Poverty, big problem. One of many issues could be Baltimore City Council raises the minimum wage to $20 an hour by 2026 for employees of companies of 10 or more people. If what interests you is food security, one possible issue you could work on, by 2026, Liberia's Minister of Interior ends overfishing by giving fishermen a dedicated percentage of the catch in exchange for counting everything they catch and adhering to scientifically set catch limits. You see how specific these are? That is an issue. An issue is very specific. Any questions? Okay, well, we'll do questions at the end too. Okay, so you've settled on a problem and an actionable issue, and so now you need goals. Like, what exactly do you want a decision maker to do for you? What would constitute a victory? How are you going to quantify your success? You're going to break up your goals into two types of goals, and the first are your issue goals. So these should be short-term, mid-term, and long-term. And here's another example from the alcohol policy field. So the big problem here is excessive alcohol consumption, which kills 88,000 people a year, costs the economy $249 billion a year, and is responsible for 47% of homicides. So big problem. But one actionable, solvable issue could be to increase the price of alcohol. So therefore, a short-term goal could be that you get 3 city councils to pass resolutions calling for a reduction in underage drinking. A midterm goal could be that the state legislative committee has a hearing on youth access to alcohol, and your long-term goal being passing a 10-cent alcohol tax. And your supporters need to see victories along the way. People aren't going to stick around for just a long-term victory that's 5 or 10 or 30 years down the road, right? So you need things that people can feel good about and that will motivate and inspire them to increase their involvement over time. But once you decide on your problem and your issue, what's your strategic vehicle going to be? Like, what are you going to do? Are you going to pass a bill? Are you going to change a regulation in an executive branch, like with the president, the governor, or mayor? Are you going to win an election, influence a court decision? Are you going to change corporate behavior? Or are you going to craft a budget? And budgets are really important. I'm going to let this guy tell you a little bit about budgets.
Don't tell me what you value. Show me your budget and I will tell you what you value. Show me your budget and I will tell you what you value.
Oops. Budgets are so important, and I urge everyone to pay attention to budgets. There's a saying in DC, budget drives policy. There are so many bills that pass legislative bodies that have no money attached to them, and it's as good as having no bill. So if you don't have a budget, you don't have a program, you need to know who writes the budgets that you care about, that will fund the things that you care about. If you're working at the federal level, you need to know the person in the Office of Management and Budget who prepares the
The
president's...
ballot box is
Oh my
sacred
God, it's Joe
ground
Biden again.
in America.
Hi, Joe.
That's where we make our
I'm
voices
not ready
heard.
for you, Joe.
That's where we decide.
Sorry, how'd that even happen? Sorry, I didn't know he'd keep talking. But okay. So OMB prepares the president's budget, which is released, I believe it's the first Monday of every February. And a year or year and a half before the release date, people at OMB are going back and forth with the agency that oversees your issues, and they're figuring out how much money goes in the president's budget request. So you need to get to know the person at OMB who puts pen to paper and writes out how much money Congress should give for the program you care about. And that is true for the governor's budget too. The governor isn't writing these things. The governor has people who do this. Those people have phones at their desks. You need to get to know them. And in my experience, the people who draft budgets are sitting in an office and they have sometimes they've had no communication with people who are directly affected by the problem. So you need to draft the budget you want to see for the programs you care about. Call up the person who's drafting the budget. Say, hey, I'd like you to meet these people who are directly affected by the problem. They'll probably think that's really cool because they haven't done that. And the person who knows the most about your issue may well be you, right? So you know exactly how much money needs to be spent to solve the problem. So you need to come prepared with the budget that you have drafted. So the other kind of goals you need are organizational goals, right? So you'll need to ask yourself, like, how will this campaign help strengthen your organization? How will it recruit and develop new activists? How will you involve existing members? How are you going to quantify your success? How many new contacts do you need in the governing body, maybe in the media? How are you going to develop new leaders? What kind of endorsements do you want from newspapers, other media outlets? And how many opinion leaders do you want to have on board? Those are the kinds of organizational goals that you'll need to have. So the number and size of goals that you tackle will depend on how many resources you have. If there's just two of you with no budget, then you may just take on one goal. But if you work for a well-funded organization with a lot of people, you might tackle several goals at a time. Effective advocacy must be based on strong, credible data on the extent of the problem and who's affected by it. So data shows you the size of the problem, and it justifies your concerns and your advocacy actions. It proves that some people and places are affected by the problem more than others, so that the problem's not just random. Research is what takes you from there's a problem with young people drinking to waiters and bartenders are habitually serving alcohol to intoxicated patrons in the Federal Hill neighborhood bars and restaurants between midnight and 2 a.m. on Thursday, Friday, and Saturdays, which is why anyone who serves alcohol should be trained on how to avoid this, and law enforcement should have adequate funding to enforce the law. So to get the kind of change you want to see in the world, You need to influence the behavior of specific people. These are individuals, they're not legislative bodies, they're not boards. Since your target's going to be a specific person. So you need to know what motivates that person, learn everything you can about that person, and you need to base your campaign's activities on a thorough understanding of that person and direct your resources that direction. You need to be able to answer questions about your targets, like who do they listen to? What boards do they sit on? Where do they go to college? Who is their family? How are friends? How could I reach those people? So we break up targets into primary and secondary targets, and then we also have public audiences. So the primary targets are the people who can give you what you want. They can vote yes, they can vote no. They're the people who can take the action that will make the change. Those people can be senators, representatives, governors, mayors, the director of an executive branch agency, the chairman of a board, a city council president, the county council chair, or a judge. Secondary targets are people who can influence your primary targets. It's because they have seniority, they are political party leadership, they may be campaign donors, they might be business leaders. So you see down the bottom, they could be what we call grass tops. So grassroots is from the bottom up, grass tops, the top down. It's like the difference between the person who signed your petition in front of Safeway versus someone who already has influence over your target decision maker. And then we also work with the public audiences. We're not out to convince everybody. You don't need to convince everybody. You just need to convince enough people. So public audiences are people who have influence over your primary and secondary targets. It could be moms, maybe of kids of a certain age. It could be workers, hunters and anglers. It could be business owners. I'll give you an example of a campaign that really chose its target wisely. So if you want to save the boreal rainforest of Canada, right, you need to know who's cutting them down. So let's say you learn that who's cutting them down is a company called International Paper. And they're cutting down endangered rainforests to make 395 million Victoria's Secret catalogs each year. So you could target International Paper, but like, what's that? Where do we find them? Who's in charge? What do they do? I don't know anything about them. But the CEO of Victoria's Secret's parent company, like if that person was your target, you could reach him through his customers. Everyone knows where to find a Victoria's Secret store because they're all over the place, right? So you could tarnish their brand by doing things like demonstrations at the retail outlets. You could hand out flyers to people walking into the store. You can interact with that company in a way you can't really interact with International Paper. So that's in fact what this group that at the time was called Forest Ethics, now it's called Stand.Earth, but they launched a campaign called Victoria's Dirty Secret. And they did direct action at retail stores across the country. They took out this full-page New York Times ad for Victoria's Dirty Secret. They had this person outside of New York Fashion Week, where Victoria's Secret had this fashion, like they're part of the fashion show. Like someone dressed like a Victoria's Secret angel, but wielding a chainsaw. And that brought the CEO of Limited Brands to the table, and he committed to sourcing his paper from another company. Like International Paper lost a huge client. And now the paper for those catalogs are sourced from sustainably grown forests. So you've got to think carefully about who your target should be. Like, where will you get the most leverage? So So part of your resource assessment is figuring out who your allies and opponents are and who has power and why. You're going to have to ask yourself which special interest groups and organizations are related to your campaign. Who shares your goals? What are their strengths and weaknesses? What might they do or spend to help you? Who might profit from your success? You also have to think about which special interest groups or organizations oppose you. What are their strengths and weaknesses? What might they do or spend to defeat you? How can you undercut your opposition's strengths? If you can't get a key group to join your effort, can you at least convince them to stay neutral? And sometimes that's okay. You should find out everything you can about individuals and organizations that are going to actively oppose your campaign. And you should consider consulting with people who used to work in that industry or from the governing body that would oversee that industry, because that's how you get the inside scoop. Even if you can just hire them for a few hours. Like buying access, if you have the resources to buy access, you should do it because your opponents sure are. There are tons of former policymakers and committee staff who will do anything for a buck. And you can find them and get the inside story. And they will, if you can't get a meeting with the decision maker, a former colleague who is for hire sure could. So if you have the money to buy access, you should do it. It might make you want to vomit. Shelve your ideals for a moment and just spend that money, even if it's just for a few hours. So you'll need to assess your organizational strengths and weaknesses. Like what resources do you have? What resources do you need in terms of time, money, connections? And you got to take a good, hard, honest look. Like this isn't time for fantasy la la land. You got to get real. Do you have, how much money do you have? Is it enough? How many active volunteers do you have? What skills do they possess? Do you have the kind of space and equipment that you'll need? What kind of experience does your leadership have with working with policymakers or with the media? I came out very light. There are 4 critical elements to successful campaigns. Not only do you need to know how to plan and organize a campaign, but you also need to know about policy making, communications, and fundraising. So policy making, you have to know what levers to pull when. And once you get some experience working at one level of government, the rest are pretty similar. So if you get experience working at the city council level where there are committees and subcommittees and chairs, and there's really one person who holds all the power on the subcommittee, and how the larger legislative body interacts with the various committees and subcommittees. I mean, it's all pretty similar whether you're working at Congress or the state legislature or city council. So learn one level of government, and you'll learn it pretty quickly. You learn this stuff by doing it. Fundraising, sure, lots of good things have been won in the world for no money. But if you want to win the big stuff, it costs a lot. So you might not be the person who does the fundraising, but you're going to need a fundraising plan. You're going to need to find those people who can help you fundraise. The heavier the lift, the more it's going to cost. And communication. So campaign communications is about changing how people define your issue and how you communicate with your target decision makers about the change you want to see and what the consequences will be for them if they don't meet your demand. So you're going to develop plans for all of these, and sometimes you'll have plans within plans. At the very least, you need these communications tools. You need a one-pager. It is one side of one page. It has all the basics and what the reader needs to do. So it has a call to action. You need a myths versus facts to debunk your opponent's arguments. You need a frequently asked questions. And if you start working on an issue, you know what the same 3 or 4 questions that come up over and over are. So you respond to them in such a tool. You need a presentation that you or your supporters can give. Do like PowerPoint, make a script. You can hand it off to someone. They can tailor it to meet their local needs. You need a 30-second speech. Some people call this an elevator speech. I used to also until I worked in a place where there weren't elevators. So 30-second speech. You run into someone in the buffet line or somewhere in the cafeteria in the bottom of the congressional office building. You need to be able to say quickly what the problem is, why people should care, what the cost of inaction is, and what the solution is. You practice these things in front of a mirror. Finally, you need a report or white paper that's all the gory details with citations. That's going to be overkill for most people, but you need to have it because congressional committee staff will want to see it, reporters will want to see it, and you need to cite all your work. You do not want to be caught not knowing where your data comes from. You don't ever want that to be the story, right? So you don't have to put your citations on every document that you make and take up valuable real estate on a one-pager with 95 citations, but you can have that on a separate sheet just so you can get to it quickly. So with campaigns, we try to make things happen that weren't already going to happen anyway. So to do that, we're probably going to have to pressure policymakers to say yes to you. And if they say no to you, or if they say yes and then don't follow through, it's your influence that shows them that there will be consequences to their actions. It's your influence that will make their lives harder by having to answer to people like they get 100 phone calls into their office that you instigated, right? So part of our jobs as advocates is making people's lives harder and threatening their job. I don't know what the audio here is supposed to be. That isn't on my deck, but anyway. Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House in the 1980s, said that power is the perception of power. I was recently working on a state legislative campaign, and we made up these one-pagers to hand out to policymakers. And it had all the basics, like the information, please vote yes on our bills. And it had all these logos at the bottom. And you look at the sheet like, wow, that's a lot of logos. That's a lot of power. These people must be really influential. I knew that 3 of those logos were for organizations that have 2 people and no budget. So some of this work is smoke and mirrors, and that's okay. The perception of power is often enough. So how do you build influence? You organize and mobilize lots of people. You recruit grass tops or influential people. You do institution-based organizing. So you get organizations to agree to activate their members, their congregants, and you amplify your voice through the media and build coalitions. So we break the public into 3 groups, and we do the same with policymakers. Some of you may have heard from Vinnie DeMarco because he speaks a lot at this school. He breaks the public into 3 groups: rabid third, middle third, anti-third. I use our base, persuadables, their base. They're generally the same idea. You ask different groups of people to do different things. According to Vinnie DeMarco, the rabid third, those are the people who will do anything for you. And those are the people who you ask them to take action, you ask them to donate money, make a call, come to a meeting or a rally. If it's a policymaker who's clearly part of your base, you want to solidify their commitment, thank them, and ask them to take the one best action. Assume you only get to request one thing of them. You won't get to go back over and over. What's the one best thing they can do for you? The persuadables, you need to secure the support of enough of them. You don't need everyone. You can often figure out exactly how many you need. If it's a policy maker who's on the fence, right, they may vote for you, they may vote against you. So they are persuadables, and their vote matters more than their opinion of you. Personally, I don't care if a policymaker agrees with me or not. I care about whether they vote my way or not. Like, you can apply enough political pressure to someone who disagrees with you, and they will vote your way anyway. And sometimes neutrality is your goal. Their base or the anti-third, if it's the public, write them off. If it's a policymaker, vote them out. So the organization building cycle goes something like this. So we move people up the ladder of engagement over time. We ask them to take action. We thank them a bunch when they do. You can't thank people enough times. You inform them, like, your action created this change, thanks. Do you want to come to our next planning meeting, right? You involve and ask, and you do this over and over and over. I consider anyone who's not on my payroll to be a volunteer. Like, if you're not getting paid to do work on my campaign, I will treat you like a volunteer, because I know you don't have to be taking my meetings or, writing that story in the newspaper for me. But I appreciate that you are. A little bit about tactics. So tactics are actions that you do to someone. You got to be clear about how and why a particular action will move your target policymaker closer to saying yes to you. That means don't run out and make banners and T-shirts because you think that's what campaigns need. But too many campaigns spend too much time on activities that don't make any difference to policymakers. I know a lot of fields have an 80-20 rule. There's an 80-20 rule in organizing too. So lots of organizations spend 80% of their resources trying to persuade people to agree with them. They make videos and charts and T-shirts and hats and banners and maps and all this stuff. And they spend only 20% of their resources applying pressure through phone calls, letters, meetings, rally, like pressure. Organizations need to flip that around. You need to apply 80% of your resources to pressure and 20% to persuasion. This is one of my favorites. Yeah, don't run out and make T-shirts or banners because you think that they'll make a difference. Every tactic you use has to have a clear purpose. So you got to figure out your timeline of activities and actions. And your campaign timeline describes the specific activities that you'll undertake, who's responsible for getting them done, and by when they will be completed. It's helpful to set a deadline in the future and then work backwards. You want to get this thing done in 5 years or 2 years. Well, then what has to happen in a year? What has to happen 6 months from now? What has to happen 2 months from now? What has to happen this week? And your timeline should include the schedule of the decision-making body. It should include holidays and anniversaries that could serve as news hooks, election dates, and other deadlines. So everything that's relevant to your campaign should go in your timeline. So if you want to get experience organizing, you want to learn more about it, Well, first, volunteer, right? So what is your dream organization working on? What are their advocacy goals? Just get online and find out. If you are able to work for a group like the PIRGs, the Public Interest Research Group, they knock on doors, they corner you on the street asking for money. There's a lot of turnover in those kinds of organizations, and you can move up the ranks pretty quickly. But that's a great hands-on experience in organizing. There are some classes that you can take. I teach Introduction to Campaigning and Organizing during the summer and third terms. I also teach it as a in-person practicum over third and fourth terms. So I place students in organizations where they get hands-on experience as organizers. And then there's the media advocacy course that is now being offered by my colleague Rami Eck, and she offers that during the fourth term. So we have reached the end of my portion of this presentation. I would love to hear your questions and comments. And that's how you can find me at either of those email addresses, ayelet15@jhu.edu or ayelethines@gmail.com.
Hi, thank you for this. I'm wondering, how do you respond to public health leaders and public health institutions who use the common narrative, this is a public health issue, not a political issue? And do you think it's an effective strategy to depoliticize some of the problems and issues that we're working on?
Can you give me an example?
I know that in reproductive rights,
Yeah.
there are leaders who say, this is public health, this is not politics, or in addressing things like drug use and stuff like that. I've seen, at least here and at other institutions, public health saying we need to be as nonpartisan as possible. We need to be objective researchers. This isn't about politics.
Yeah. That comes up a lot. I don't want to appear biased. I believe that most problems can be solved through organizing. Take an Ebola outbreak. I'd say that's a political problem. We know how to prevent that. If we apply enough resources to a community, we know how to prevent that. How do you apply resources to a community? How do you fund clinics and education programs? Those are political decisions. So I can appreciate the position that researchers are in, wanting to appear unbiased, but what will solve the problem that they want to solve in the world, right? You got to take the research out into the streets, and how that happens, how that translation occurs is political.
Two questions. One is, I always, get to the point that we do a lot of phone calling and emailing, but it's they know me. So I don't feel like I'm so effective when they know me and they know I'm a squeaky wheel.
Right, so you're feeling like there needs to be more of you because they need to hear from more people. It can't just be you.
Yeah, well, we in my organization, we have action alerts that we send out to get people to call, usually local government on specific issues. And I don't know if other people in my organization feel like that, but I certainly feel like,
Right.
yeah. But do you think that it's still worth doing those kind of things?
It's absolutely still worth doing it. If you feel like that you need to turn up the heat because you're not getting the results you want to see, maybe it's time to partner with a congregation or somehow access a new network of people who share your goals. But I think it's always worth doing. And you'd be surprised how few people it takes to make change. I worked on a very well-funded campaign, and we had like the top decision maker, an administrator of a large federal agency was totally supportive. She actually came up with the idea and the campaign. So we had a ton of support at the top. And there were just a few squeaky wheels in this southern state. It was like 3 guys. They had a blog, and they derailed all of our work because we hadn't like backfilled the support, because my organization at the time thought that, well, we've got support at the very top, so we're infallible. Well, that's not true. It just took a few squeaky wheels. We pulled that one out of the hole, but it didn't have to be so hard. So my point is that your voice makes more of a difference than you might feel it does. You're not the only person who shares your views. I urge you to find others in your community who might. Maybe consider some non-traditional allies. And you might get tired of hearing yourself over and over, but I think you're probably talking about these things more than those people hear about it.
Okay, a second question is, when you get into collecting money and spending money on things like Facebook ads that are pretty inexpensive, but there's this whole legal kind of aspect to it that you have to form some type of corporation or a 503c, and then you have to worry about the legal liability of it, at least for campaigning for candidates, and it's just exhausting and hard for grassroots organizations.
Yeah, there are legal lines you shouldn't cross, and as a volunteer on your own time, you can do anything. So if you feel like you are restricted in your political movements, you might have to take half a day off work. And Facebook ads are cheap at first. They add up quickly. You need to have very clear goals with those, and do a lot of testing so you don't spend $1,000 before you know it. But depending on what you're trying to do, you might not need to incorporate as a 501c3. Consider joining an organization that already has all that, right? Like you might be able to lend your expertise and connections to an organization that is already existing. Don't reinvent the wheel if you don't have to. Happy to talk about it more. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. This is excellent. So one of the disconnects we all have at Johns Hopkins is that we say we're the greatest school of public health, and then we look out the window. And we look at Baltimore and we see 20-year life expectancy gaps, and we say, well, how come we're such a great school of public health? So this is part of the way forward for the next 100 years, I think. But I'm worried because here, the map you showed of obesity showed we have one set of national laws, and yet we have concentrated obesity in a part of the country. We have one set of state laws, concentrated counties and cities. We have one set of city laws, and that there's a 20-year life expectancy gap inside the city. So if I just pass the world's most perfect laws in a city, I still have 20-year life expectancy gaps. So isn't there another kind of community organizing that says it's not about what City Hall does, it's not, that's good, and obviously City Hall has room to improve, and let's keep you going. But if we spend 100 years getting Maryland to have the best laws, USA, cities, is that going to help Hollins Park? Isn't there another kind of community organizing where people create agency and rise up to make their lives better? Or is it everything going up to the governor and the mayor and fixing them? Isn't there something else?
Well, advocacy can happen within institutions, and it can happen like pushing from the outside. So that's what direct action is about, like create the world you want, right? You want the neighbors in that area to have free childcare. Everyone brings their babies to, I don't know, the mayor's house or the city councilman's house or something, and you create a daycare right there. And like, you create the world that you want. You put your body on the line to keep something from happening, or you just take the resources that you want in a planned way, not in a way that sends you to prison, but like nonviolent direct action can achieve those goals, but you have to be really clear about like what would make a difference there. Is it that they don't get enough money? Is it that they don't have enough services? Like, what is the thing that you want? Because what I hear is the problem. People in this particular neighborhood live there's that 20-year life expectancy gap. What is the thing that would solve that?
You might talk about in Baltimore City, for example, violence reduction and the work that you're doing to reduce liquor outlet licenses, because I think that is looking at a very concentrated epidemic in a part of Baltimore that doesn't affect other parts of Baltimore.
Yeah.
So
good point. Good point. So if you want to dismantle structural racism, one way to do that is address the fact that there's a liquor store on almost every corner in the most historically disenfranchised communities in this city. That's a policy choice. And so, there is a clear decision maker there. And when CDC says 47% of homicides are attributable to alcohol, because when you're intoxicated, you're either more likely to be a perpetrator or a victim, that's almost 50%. That's almost half of the homicides in this city caused by alcohol. So, one way to dismantle that structural racism is close those outlets that are fueling the homicide epidemic. So I'm curious about what is the thing that would make a difference? Because that would help us determine who can give you what you want and how to get them to say yes.
Ayelet, we have time for one more question, and it came from one of our live stream listeners. So she asked, you talked about getting to OMB to influence the budget. Can anyone access those departments, or do you need an introduction?
Well, it's always helpful to have an introduction. Sometimes I go to my member of Congress for introductions, because I'm his constituent, and his staff will send a letter for me or ask for a meeting on my behalf. And sometimes I make cold calls. So just try different things and see what works. But you have as much access, or you should have as much access as anyone else. You don't need to be invited to the party. It helps to have someone open the door, if you can. If you can't, cold call.
Well, thank you so much, Ayelet, and thank you
Thank
everyone
you.
for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.
We appreciate it.